I remember the scorching heat beating down on my back, the endless sand stretching beneath my feet like a cruel mirage. My son had left me there to die. If you told me a year ago that my own flesh and blood would betray me so completely, I wouldn't have believed it. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Eleanor, and I'm 72 years old. For the past 50 years, I've lived in a cramped two-bedroom apartment on the 6th floor of a crumbling building in the South Bronx. Every morning, I wake up to the sound of sirens, the smell of burnt coffee drifting from our ancient percolator, and walls covered in peeling floral wallpaper that I painted over so many times I've lost count. The routine never changed. I'd shuffle to the kitchen in my worn slippers, the ones with holes that I kept promising myself I'd replace. I'd make breakfast for my son Marcus while he slept until noon, scrambling eggs the way he liked them, with too much salt and barely any pepper. I'd iron his shirts, wash his dishes, clean up the cigarette butts he'd leave scattered across our tiny balcony like breadcrumbs of his contempt. I did this every single day for decades, hoping that someday, somehow, he'd look at me with something other than irritation in his eyes. That he'd see all I sacrificed. That he'd understand the weight I carried on my bent shoulders, the dreams I buried so he could chase his own. But on that Tuesday morning in March, everything changed. I was sitting at our scratched kitchen table, staring at the phone in my trembling hands. The voicemail was still playing in my head, over and over, like a broken record of betrayal. "Ma, I'm not coming to lunch today. Or next week. Or probably ever again. You and your stupid treasure fantasies, you're living in a dream world. Nobody wants to hear about some made-up gold mine from Grandpa's fairy tales. Get real." The silence that followed felt heavier than the cast-iron skillet I dropped on the floor that morning. The clatter echoed through our small apartment, but nothing could drown out the truth that was finally sinking in. My son didn't just doubt me. He despised me for believing in something he couldn't understand. You see, 6 months earlier, I had discovered something that would change everything. Hidden in my grandfather's old trunk, buried beneath moth-eaten blankets and faded photographs, I found maps. Real maps, drawn on parchment so delicate it crumbled at the edges when I touched it. These weren't the sketches of a delusional old man. They were detailed surveys of a piece of land in the Mojave Desert, land that had been in our family for over 100 years. My grandfather, rest his soul, had been a prospector back in the 1920s. He'd spent his life searching for gold in the California desert, and according to these maps, he'd found it. Not just a few nuggets or a small claim. We're talking about a treasure worth over $100 million, buried deep beneath the sand on property that legally belonged to me. I tried to show Marcus the maps. I spread them out on our kitchen table one evening, my hands shaking with excitement as I traced the pathways with my finger. The compass was there too, an antique brass instrument wrapped in cracked leather, its needle still pointing true north after all these years. "Look," I whispered, my voice breaking with hope. "This is it, Marcus. This is our way out. No more struggling, no more worrying about rent or groceries or whether we'll have enough heat this winter." He laughed. Not a gentle chuckle or even a skeptical smile. He threw his head back and laughed so hard that beer nearly shot out of his nose. "Ma, you're losing it," he said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Grandpa was a drunk and a dreamer. Those maps are probably something he drew while he was loaded." The sting of his words cut deeper than any physical pain I'd ever endured. But I pressed on, desperate to make him understand. "I had them authenticated, Marcus. I took them to an expert at Columbia University. They're real. The handwriting matches samples from Grandpa's journals. The paper dates back to the right time period. Everything checks out." His expression shifted from amusement to irritation. "Even if they're real, so what? You think you're gonna grab a shovel and start digging in the desert like some crazy old woman? Face it, Ma, you're chasing ghosts." That night, after he stomped off to his room and slammed the door so hard our neighbor downstairs pounded on their ceiling, I sat alone in the dark. The maps were still spread across the table, and in the dim light from the street lamp outside our window, they looked like ancient treasure maps from a pirate movie. But they were real. I knew they were real. And I was going to prove it. Let me tell you about the years that led up to that moment. The decades of sacrifice that built a foundation of love so deep I thought nothing could crack it. How wrong I was. When Marcus was born, I was 26 years old and working as a secretary for a law firm in Manhattan. His father, my first and only husband, Robert, was a construction worker with calloused hands and big dreams. We lived in a studio apartment in Queens back then, barely enough room for the three of us, but we were happy. Or at least I thought we were. Robert left when Marcus was 8. No explanation, no goodbye. Just a note on the kitchen counter saying he'd found someone else and was moving to Florida. The divorce papers came in the mail 3 months later, along with a check for $200 and a promise of child support that never materialized. So there I was, a single mother in New York City, trying to raise a boy who was already showing signs of his father's restless anger. I took a second job cleaning office buildings at night. From 6 in the evening until 2 in the morning, I'd scrub toilets and empty trash cans in those gleaming skyscrapers in Midtown. Then I'd come home, catch 3 hours of sleep, and get Marcus ready for school. "Mom, I need new sneakers," he'd say, pointing to the holes forming in the soles of his Converse. And somehow, I'd find the money. I'd skip meals, negotiate with the landlord, borrow from neighbors. Whatever it took. "Mom, everyone else is going to summer camp." And I'd work overtime for 2 months, my back aching and my hands raw from industrial cleaning chemicals, just to send him away for 2 weeks. "Mom, I want to try out for the baseball team, but I need equipment." Out would come my emergency fund, the $20 bills I'd hidden in a coffee can behind the flour. Every request was met with the same response: "Of course, baby. Mama will figure it out." And I always did. Even when it meant eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner while he enjoyed takeout Chinese food. Even when it meant wearing the same 3 outfits to work for months so he could have name-brand clothes for school. Even when it meant lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling and wondering how I'd pay the electric bill. The gratitude I expected never came. Instead, his requests became demands. His tone grew sharper, more impatient. When he turned 16 and wanted a car, I worked 3 jobs for an entire summer to buy him a beat-up Honda Civic that barely ran. His response? "Thanks, I guess. But all my friends have newer cars." When he graduated high school and decided he wanted to study business at a community college, I refinanced our apartment and took out loans I knew I'd never be able to repay. His response? He dropped out after 1 semester and spent the next 2 years finding himself, while I continued to pay the bills. By the time Marcus reached his 30s, our relationship had settled into a cold, transactional routine. He'd call when he needed money. He'd visit when he wanted a free meal. He'd remember my birthday about half the time, usually with a generic card picked up from a gas station. The conversations became shorter, more distant. "How are you feeling, baby?" I'd ask when he'd call. "Fine," he'd grunt, already distracted by whatever was playing on his television. "Listen, Ma, I'm a little short this month. Think you could help me out?" And like a fool, I always said yes. 500 here, 1,000 there. Money I didn't have for emergencies I couldn't verify. But he was my son. My only family. What else was I supposed to do? The breaking point came that winter, just before I found those maps. It was my 70th birthday, and I'd planned a small celebration. Nothing fancy, just Marcus, maybe a few neighbors, some cake from the bakery down the street. I spent the whole day cleaning our apartment, cooking his favorite meal, setting the table with the good china I'd been saving for special occasions. He was supposed to arrive at 6. By 7:30, I was still sitting alone at the table, the candles melting into puddles of wax, the food growing cold. I called his phone twice. No answer. I sent a text message: "Are you okay? I'm worried." The response came 3 hours later: "Something came up. Rain check." There was no rain check. There never is when someone doesn't want to be somewhere. I spent that birthday night sitting on our fire escape, looking out over the Bronx and wondering when I'd become so invisible to the person I loved most in the world. The city lights blurred through my tears, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt completely and utterly alone. That's when the bitterness started to creep in. Little thoughts that I'd push away as soon as they formed. Am I just an ATM to him? Does he even care if I'm alive? What would happen if I just stopped? Stopped giving, stopped trying, stopped pretending that love looks like this. But every time those thoughts surfaced, I'd remember him as a little boy. The way he'd curl up next to me on the couch during thunderstorms. How his face would light up when I'd surprise him with his favorite cookies. The Mother's Day cards he'd make in elementary school, covered in crayon hearts and crooked letters spelling out, "I love you, Mommy." Those memories were my anchor and my prison. They kept me tethered to a version of him that maybe never really existed, or at least hadn't existed in decades. Have you ever loved someone so completely that you lost yourself in the process? Have you ever given so much of your heart that you forgot you deserved some back? Then came the maps, and with them, a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, I could change our story. If I could prove that the treasure was real, if I could show Marcus that his crazy old mother wasn't delusional after all, maybe he'd look at me with respect instead of pity. Maybe he'd see me as more than just a burden to be managed. I spent weeks researching. I pored over genealogy records, property deeds, historical documents about gold mining in California. Everything pointed to the same conclusion: my grandfather had indeed found something significant, and the legal claim to that land was valid. The property was remote, accessible only by a rutted dirt road that wound through miles of desert scrub. But according to the maps, the treasure was buried in a specific location, marked by 3 distinctive rock formations that would be easy to identify. I hired a lawyer. Not some big-shot attorney from Manhattan, but a kind woman named Sarah Gonzalez who worked out of a small office in the Bronx. She specialized in property law and inheritance cases, and when I showed her the documents, her eyes widened with genuine interest. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, leaning back in her chair, "if these maps are authentic, and if your grandfather's claim was properly filed, you could be sitting on a fortune." We filed the necessary paperwork to establish my legal right to excavate the property. We obtained permits, hired surveyors, arranged for proper equipment. It wasn't cheap, but I liquidated my small savings account and took out a loan against our apartment. Everything I had went into this one last gamble. Throughout this entire process, Marcus remained skeptical at best, hostile at worst. When I told him about the lawyer, he rolled his eyes. When I showed him the permits, he accused me of wasting money we couldn't afford. When I explained that we might need to travel to California to investigate the site, he laughed bitterly and said, "You're really gonna die out there chasing fairy tales, aren't you, Ma?" His words stung, but I pressed forward. I had to. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about proving that I was more than just the woman who cleaned up his messes and paid his bills. It was about showing him that his mother had value beyond what I could provide. The first major betrayal came in late February. I was organizing all the documents related to the treasure claim when I noticed something was missing. The original survey map, the most important piece of evidence, was gone from my filing cabinet. I tore the apartment apart looking for it. Under beds, behind furniture, in every drawer and closet. Nothing. 3 days later, I found a receipt in Marcus's jeans pocket when I was doing laundry. A wire transfer receipt for $10,000, sent to a company called Desert Recovery LLC in Las Vegas. The date was the same day my map went missing. My hands shook as I stared at that piece of paper. $10,000. More than I had in my bank account. More than I'd spent on myself in the past 5 years combined. And he'd sent it to a company connected to desert excavation without telling me. The confrontation was uglier than anything I'd experienced in my 70 years of life. I waited for him to come home from wherever he spent his days, sitting in my recliner with the receipt clutched in my fist like evidence in a murder trial. "Where did you get $10,000? I asked when he walked through the door. He froze. Just for a second, but long enough for me to see the guilt flash across his face. Then his expression hardened into the familiar mask of irritation. "I don't know what you're talking about." I held up the receipt. "Desert Recovery LLC. Care to explain?" The lie came so easily that I wondered how many others there had been. "I borrowed it from a friend. I'm looking into your treasure thing too, okay? Maybe I can find out what's really out there before you waste any more of our money." "Our money?" The words came out sharper than I intended. "When did my savings become our money?" "Come on, ma. You're my mother. We're family. What's yours is mine, right? And what's yours is mine too." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "What's mine? I don't have anything. I live in this dump with you, remember? I don't even have a car that works half the time. Because I bought you that car. Because I pay for this apartment. Because everything you have came from me working myself into the ground for 50 years. Nobody asked you to do that." The silence that followed those words stretched between us like a chasm. Nobody asked me to sacrifice everything for him. Nobody asked me to love him more than I loved myself. Nobody asked me to build my entire identity around being his mother. He was right, and that's what made it hurt so much. "I want my map back," I said quietly. "I don't have your stupid map. Someone took it from my filing cabinet. Someone who had access to this apartment and knew exactly what they were looking for. Maybe you just misplaced it. You're getting old, Ma. Your memory isn't what it used to be." That was when something inside me cracked. Not broke, not yet, but cracked like ice on a pond when the weight becomes too much to bear. "Get out," I whispered. "What?" "Get out of my apartment. Get out of my life. I'm done." He stared at me for a long moment, then shrugged. "Fine. But when you come crawling back because you're lonely and scared and can't figure out how to work the TV remote, don't expect me to pretend this never happened." The door slammed behind him with enough force to rattle the windows. I sat in that chair for hours afterward, listening to the building settle around me, wondering if I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. But I wasn't done fighting yet. The next morning, I called my lawyer and explained what had happened. Sarah was furious. He stole legal documents related to an active case, she said. That's not just theft, it's interference with a legal proceeding. We filed a police report, though I knew nothing would come of it. We also contacted Desert Recovery LLC to find out what services they'd provided for that $10,000. The answer was both enlightening and devastating. Marcus had hired them to conduct a preliminary excavation of the site. Using my stolen map, they'd located the area and begun digging. They'd found something, all right. Evidence of old mining activity, metal detector readings that suggested significant deposits, and geological surveys that confirmed the presence of gold-bearing ore. In other words, Marcus had used my own money and stolen documents to prove that I was right all along. Then he'd kept the information to himself. The betrayal cut so deep I could barely breathe. This wasn't just about money or respect anymore. This was about a son who was willing to destroy his mother to get what he wanted. Who was willing to let me believe I was crazy while he secretly worked to claim my inheritance for himself. I spent that night on the bathroom floor, sobbing until my throat was raw and my eyes were swollen shut. The sound that came from my chest wasn't crying exactly. It was something more primitive, like an animal caught in a trap. It was the sound of a heart breaking not just in half, but into pieces so small they could never be put back together. When morning came, I was different. Not stronger yet, but emptier. Hollow. Like someone had reached inside my chest and scooped out everything that made me who I was. I knew I had two choices: give up and let him win, or fight back with everything I had left. I chose to fight. The first step was reclaiming control of my finances. I went to the bank and changed all my account numbers. I removed Marcus from my emergency contact list and made sure he couldn't access any of my resources. I also met with a financial advisor to discuss how to fund the excavation project without putting myself at risk of losing everything. The advisor, a gentleman named David who reminded me of my grandfather, was honest about the risks. "Mrs. Patterson, at your age, this kind of speculation could be dangerous. If you're wrong about the treasure, you could lose your home. If I don't try," I told him, "I'll lose myself." We worked out a conservative plan. I'd take out a small loan against my apartment, enough to fund a professional excavation team for 1 week. If they found nothing, I'd walk away and figure out how to rebuild my life. If they found something, well, that would change everything. But first, I had to get to California. I had to see the land for myself, touch the soil my grandfather had walked on, understand what he'd been trying to tell me all these years. The flight from JFK to Las Vegas was my first time on an airplane in 20 years. As we climbed above the clouds, I pressed my face to the window and watched New York disappear below me. Somewhere down there was my apartment, my neighborhood, my entire life. And for the first time in decades, I felt free from it. I rented a car at the airport, a small SUV that I could barely afford but needed for the desert roads. The drive from Las Vegas to the property took 3 hours, most of it on highways that cut straight through landscapes so vast and empty it made me feel like the last person on Earth. The property was exactly as I'd imagined it from studying the maps. 30 acres of scrub brush and rocky outcroppings, surrounded by mountains that rose like ancient monuments against the blue sky. There was no cell phone service, no houses visible in any direction. Just me, the desert, and whatever secrets lay buried beneath its surface. I found the 3 rock formations mentioned in the map without much trouble. They formed a triangle roughly 50 yards across, with the excavation site marked at the center. Standing there in the afternoon heat, I could almost see my grandfather as a young man, pickaxe in hand, chasing a dream that his own family would dismiss as fantasy. The excavation team arrived the next morning. For professionals with ground-penetrating radar, metal detectors, and enough digging equipment to move serious earth. They were efficient, methodical, and respectful of the fact that this meant everything to me. On the second day, they found something. Not gold, not yet, but evidence of previous mining activity. Tool marks on stone, fragments of old equipment, and most importantly, a shaft that descended deep into the earth. "Ma'am," the foreman said, wiping sweat from his brow, "there's definitely something down there. We're reading significant metal deposits about 20 feet down. If you want us to keep going, we can, but it's going to require some serious excavation." I thought about Marcus then. About his laughter, his dismissal, his theft of my documents. About all the times he'd made me feel small and foolish for believing in something he couldn't understand. "Keep digging," I said. They found it on the 4th day. Not just traces of gold, but actual ore deposits that would require professional mining equipment to extract fully. The assayer I'd hired independently confirmed what the excavation team suspected. We were looking at a find worth potentially $20 to $30 million, with the possibility of much more if the deposits continued deeper. I was sitting on a folding chair in the shade of a mesquite tree when they brought me the first sample. A chunk of rock about the size of a golf ball, shot through with veins of gold that caught the sunlight like liquid fire. I held it in my palms and cried. Not from happiness, not from vindication, but from a grief so profound it took my breath away. My grandfather had been right. I had been right. And the one person I'd wanted most to share this with had betrayed me in the cruelest way possible. That night, alone in my motel room in a tiny desert town whose name I can't even remember, I called Marcus. I don't know why. Maybe I still believed, somewhere deep in my naive heart, that he'd be happy for me. That he'd apologize and we could find our way back to each other. The phone rang 4 times before he picked up. What do you want, Ma? I found it, I said simply. The treasure. It's real. Silence. Then, how much? Not congratulations. Not, I'm sorry I doubted you. Not, I'm proud of you for not giving up. Just, how much? Maybe 20 or 30 million. They're still evaluating. More silence. I could hear his breathing, hear the television in the background. And you're calling me because? Because you're my son. Because I thought you'd want to know. I already knew, Ma. I told you I was looking into it. The casual admission hit me like a physical blow. You knew? The company I hired found the same deposits weeks ago. I was working on a way to legally claim the property before you screwed everything up by getting lawyers involved. It's my property, Marcus. My inheritance. Yeah, but you're old. You could die tomorrow. Then what happens to all that money? You think the state's gonna take care of it? I could live another 20 years. Or you could die next week. Face it, Ma. You need someone younger to handle this kind of thing. Someone who knows how to deal with mining companies and investors and all that complicated stuff. The conversation that followed is burned into my memory like a scar. He laid out his plan with the cold efficiency of a business proposal. I would sign over legal control of the excavation to him. He would manage the mining operation and the sale of the gold. I would receive a generous allowance of $50,000 a year for the rest of my life. Think about it, Ma. 50 grand a year is more than you've ever had. You could move somewhere nice, maybe get a little condo in Florida. No more worrying about rent or bills or any of that stuff. And you would control everything else? I'd handle everything. All the stress and complicated legal stuff. You could just relax and enjoy your retirement. I was quiet for so long that he asked if I was still there. I'm here, I said finally. So what do you think? It's a good deal, right? What I thought was that my son was offering to buy my life's work for pennies on the dollar and call it generosity. What I thought was that he'd been planning this betrayal from the moment he learned the treasure might be real. What I thought was that I'd raised a stranger who looked like my child but had the heart of a predator. What I said was, I need some time to think about it. Don't take too long, Ma. There are other companies interested in this property. If you wait too long, we might lose the opportunity entirely. The threat was subtle but clear. Agree to his terms, or he'd find a way to cut me out entirely. After I hung up, I sat on the edge of that motel bed for hours, staring at the chunk of gold I'd placed on the nightstand. In the lamplight, it looked like it was glowing from within. I was 72 years old, alone in the California desert, holding the proof of the biggest discovery of my life. And the only person I wanted to share it with was actively trying to steal it from me. That's when I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going back to New York. Not yet. I was going to stay in California and figure out how to protect what was mine. I was going to learn how to fight back. The next morning, I called my lawyer in New York and explained the situation. Sarah was livid. He's attempting to defraud you of your inheritance, she said. We need to get restraining orders filed immediately. I also called the excavation team and asked them to secure the site. No one without my written permission would be allowed access to the property. I hired a security company to monitor the area 24 hours a day. And I contacted a mining attorney in Las Vegas who specialized in exactly this kind of situation. Marcus called me 6 times that day. I didn't answer. He left voicemails that grew progressively more angry and desperate. Ma, you're being unreasonable. Ma, you don't understand how this works. Ma, if you don't call me back, I'm going to have to take action to protect both of us. The threat in that last message was unmistakable. My own son was declaring war on me. Over the next 2 weeks, I learned more about business and law than I had in my entire previous life. I met with attorneys, accountants, mining engineers, and investment advisors. I opened new bank accounts that Marcus couldn't access. I established a trust that would protect the property regardless of what happened to me. Most importantly, I began to see myself differently. Not as an old woman who needed to be managed and protected, but as someone with agency and power and the right to make decisions about her own life. The transformation wasn't easy. There were moments when the old Eleanor would surface, the one who wanted to call Marcus and apologize and beg him to love her again. The one who would rather be exploited than alone. But each time those feelings arose, I'd hold that piece of gold ore and remember what I was fighting for. Not the money, though that was certainly life-changing. What I was fighting for was respect. Recognition. The right to be seen as more than just a convenient source of funding for other people's dreams. Marcus escalated his campaign when he realized I wasn't going to back down. He sent me legal documents claiming that I was mentally incompetent to handle my own affairs. He contacted my doctor in New York, trying to get medical records that might support a case for guardianship. He even called my building super, trying to convince him that I'd been kidnapped or was being held against my will in California. When none of that worked, he tried a different approach. Love bombing, the experts would call it later. Suddenly, I was getting calls and text messages full of sweetness and nostalgia. "Ma, I miss you so much. Ma, I found some old photos of us when I was little. Remember when we went to Coney Island? Ma, I love you. I just want what's best for both of us." If this had happened a year ago, I would have melted. I would have packed my bags and flown home immediately, grateful that my son still cared about me. But now, having learned to recognize manipulation for what it was, those messages made me sad instead of hopeful. The final straw came in early May. I was staying in a small extended stay hotel in Las Vegas, close enough to the property to monitor the excavation but far enough from the desert heat to remain comfortable. The mining operation was in full swing, and conservative estimates suggested we were looking at a find worth closer to $50 million. I was having breakfast in the hotel restaurant when my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. It was a photo of my apartment building in the Bronx, taken from street level. The message read, "Shame if something happened while you were away." I stared at that message until my eggs got cold and my coffee turned bitter. My son wasn't just trying to steal my inheritance anymore. He was threatening me. I called the police in New York and filed a report. I called my lawyer and had her contact law enforcement in Las Vegas. I hired a private security company to watch my apartment building and keep Marcus away from my home. But more than anything, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades: righteous anger. Not the quiet resentment that had been building for years, but pure, clean fury at being treated like a victim by someone who was supposed to love me. That afternoon, I called Marcus directly. When he answered, his voice was syrupy sweet. "Ma, I've been so worried about you. When are you coming home?" "I saw your message," I said without preamble. "What message?" "The photo of my building. The threat." "I don't know what you're talking about. Maybe someone's trying to cause trouble between us." Even now, even caught red-handed, he was lying to me. "Marcus, I want you to listen to me very carefully. If you come near my apartment, if you contact me again without going through my lawyer, if you make any further attempts to interfere with my business, I will have you arrested." "Ma, you're scaring me. You don't sound like yourself. Maybe someone's taking advantage of you out there. Maybe you should see a doctor." "I'm seeing plenty of doctors. Lawyers too. Accountants and mining engineers and investment advisors. I'm more lucid now than I've been in years." "This isn't you talking, Ma. This is someone else, someone who's poisoning you against your own family." "No, Marcus. This is me." Finally. The silence stretched between us like a vast desert. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped its false sweetness. "You're making a big mistake. Family is all you have in this world. When those strangers are done using you, when they've taken everything you have, you'll come crawling back. And I might not be there." "I know," I said. "I'm counting on it." I hung up and immediately blocked his number. Then I sat in my hotel room and cried for the relationship that had never really existed, for the son I'd imagined I had, for the mother I'd been but would never be again. The excavation continued through the summer. What we found exceeded everyone's expectations, including mine. The deposit was extensive, high-grade, and accompanied by other valuable minerals that added significantly to the overall worth of the find. Conservative estimates put the value at close to $100 million. But money, it turned out, was the least important part of what I discovered. The real treasure was learning who I was when I wasn't defined by someone else's needs. Learning that I could make decisions, solve problems, stand up for myself. Learning that being alone wasn't the same thing as being lonely. I made friends during those months in Nevada. Real friends, people who liked me for who I was rather than what I could provide. There was Margaret, a retired teacher who'd moved to Las Vegas to be closer to her grandchildren. She taught me to play poker and took me on day trips to places like Valley of Fire and Red Rock Canyon. There was Dr. Martinez, the mining attorney who became not just my legal advisor but a genuine mentor. She was around my age, a woman who'd built a successful practice in a male-dominated field, and she helped me understand that it was never too late to reinvent yourself. There was even a romantic friendship with a gentleman named Frank, a widower who owned a small bookstore in Henderson. We'd meet for coffee twice a week and talk about everything except the past we were both trying to leave behind. For the first time in my adult life, I was surrounded by people who saw me as Eleanor, not just as Marcus's mother or Robert's ex-wife or someone's source of financial support. It was intoxicating and terrifying and absolutely wonderful. The legal battles continued, of course. Marcus hired his own attorney and contested my right to the property. He claimed that the excavation was illegal, that I was mentally incompetent, that his grandfather had intended for the inheritance to pass through the male line. None of it held up in court, but the stress and expense were considerable. There were also practical challenges. Managing a mining operation is incredibly complex, involving environmental regulations, safety protocols, equipment maintenance, and coordination with multiple contractors. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that I needed professional management, but finding the right company took months of interviews and reference checks. The most difficult part, though, was emotional. As the reality of my financial situation changed, I had to confront some hard truths about the life I'd lived and the choices I'd made. I'd spent 70 years believing that my worth was tied to how much I could sacrifice for others. Learning to value myself independently was like learning a foreign language. But gradually, things began to shift. I bought new clothes, not because I needed them but because I wanted them. I ate at nice restaurants without calculating the cost. I went to shows in Las Vegas, took weekend trips to California wine country, even flew to Hawaii for a week just because I'd always wanted to see the ocean from a different angle. More importantly, I began to set boundaries with everyone in my life. When my old neighbor from the Bronx called asking for a loan, I said no without lengthy explanations or apologies. When distant relatives suddenly emerged from nowhere with sob stories and requests for financial help, I wished them well and declined to get involved. It sounds selfish, and maybe it was. But after 7 decades of putting everyone else first, I decided I was entitled to a little selfishness. The first major test of my transformation came in late September. I was back in New York for a few days, handling some legal paperwork and checking on my apartment, when Marcus showed up unannounced. I was sorting through old photographs, deciding what to keep and what to throw away, when I heard his key in the lock. For a moment, panic seized me. The old Eleanor would have hidden the evidence of her new life, would have pretended that nothing had changed, would have welcomed him back with relief and gratitude. Instead, I stayed where I was, sitting at the kitchen table with documents from my mining operation spread out in front of me. When he walked in, I looked up calmly and said, "Hello, Marcus." He looked different. Older, more tired, like the stress of the past few months had aged him. But his eyes still held that familiar mixture of entitlement and irritation. "So you came back," he said, closing the door behind him. "I'm handling some business." "Business?" He laughed bitterly. "Is that what we're calling it now?" "That's exactly what we're calling it. This is a business transaction, Marcus. I own valuable property, and I'm developing it professionally." He moved closer, and I caught a whiff of alcohol on his breath. It was still morning. "Cut the crap, Ma. You've been hiding behind lawyers and security guards for months. Can't we just talk like family?" "We are talking. But I'm not the same person you left in this apartment 6 months ago." "No kidding. What happened to my mother? The woman who would do anything for her son?" "She grew up." The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd ever had. Marcus tried every manipulation technique in his arsenal. He reminisced about my childhood, trying to make me feel guilty for changing. He threatened to cut me out of his life permanently. He accused me of being brainwashed by people who were only interested in my money. When none of that worked, he tried tears. Actual tears, streaming down his face as he talked about how much he missed me, how sorry he was for the way he'd treated me, how he just wanted things to go back to the way they were. A year ago, those tears would have broken my heart. I would have rushed to comfort him, would have apologized for causing him pain, would have promised to make everything right. But now, sitting across from him at the same kitchen table where I'd served him thousands of meals, I felt nothing but sadness for both of us. "I can't go back, Marcus," I said finally. "Even if I wanted to, I can't become the person I was before." "Why not? What's so much better about this new life that you'd throw away your own family?" "I didn't throw anything away." "You did. When you stole my documents, when you tried to cheat me out of my inheritance, when you threatened me for standing up for myself. You threw away our relationship, not me. I was trying to protect you. No, you were trying to control me. There's a difference." He stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or perhaps just resignation. "So what happens now?" Now you leave my apartment and don't come back without permission. Now you communicate with me through my attorney if you need to communicate at all. Now you figure out how to live your own life without using me as a resource. And if I don't? Then you'll find out what it feels like to be completely cut off from someone you thought you could always count on." He left without another word. I watched from my window as he walked down the street, his shoulders slumped in defeat, and felt something I'd never experienced before: pity for my own son. But I didn't change my mind. I couldn't. The person I'd become wouldn't let me. That was the last time Marcus and I spoke for almost a year. I heard about him occasionally through mutual acquaintances. He'd moved in with a girlfriend, was working sporadically as a handyman, had been asking around about ways to contest my control of the mining operation. But he never contacted me directly, and I didn't reach out to him. Instead, I focused on building a life that had nothing to do with him. I sold my apartment in the Bronx and bought a small condo in Henderson, Nevada, close to the mountains and far from the memories that had trapped me for so long. I furnished it with new furniture, hung art on the walls that I'd chosen because I liked it, and created spaces that felt like mine alone. I also began giving away money for the first time in my life. Not to family members who saw me as an obligation, but to causes that mattered to me. I established a scholarship fund for single mothers trying to finish their education. I donated to organizations that helped elderly people avoid financial exploitation. I funded a small library in the Nevada town closest to my mining operation. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my entire life giving money to people who didn't appreciate it, and now that I had more money than I'd ever dreamed of, I was giving it to strangers who would never know my name. But it felt different. When I wrote those checks, I was choosing to help rather than being manipulated into it. I was giving from a position of strength rather than weakness. I was using my resources to make the world a little better rather than enabling destructive behavior. The mining operation continued to exceed expectations. By Christmas, conservative valuations put the total worth of the find at over $80 million, with the potential for even more as we explored deeper deposits. I was, by any measure, wealthy beyond my wildest dreams. More importantly, I was happy. Not giddy with excitement or manic with relief, but genuinely content in a way I'd never experienced. I woke up each morning looking forward to the day rather than dreading it. I made plans based on what I wanted to do rather than what others expected of me. I went to bed each night feeling satisfied with my choices rather than worried about everyone else's problems. This, I realized, was what peace felt like. The test of that peace came on Christmas Eve. I was sitting in my new living room, reading by the fireplace and listening to classical music, when my phone rang. The number was blocked, but something made me answer. "Ma?" The voice was small, tentative, almost childlike. "Hello, Marcus. I wasn't sure you'd pick up." I wasn't sure either. "How are you?" It was such a normal question, the kind of thing we'd said to each other thousands of times over the years. But now it felt loaded with meaning. How was I? I was successful, independent, financially secure, and emotionally stable. I was living in my own space, making my own decisions, and sleeping peacefully for the first time in decades. I was everything I'd never allowed myself to be when I was focused on taking care of him. "I'm well," I said simply. "How are you?" "I'm struggling. The girlfriend thing didn't work out. Work has been hard to find. I'm living in a studio apartment in Queens that's barely bigger than a closet." "I'm sorry to hear that." "Are you?" The question hung between us like a challenge. Was I sorry? Part of me was, the maternal part that couldn't help but hurt when he hurt. But another part of me, the part that had been born in the California desert, recognized this as another manipulation attempt. "I'm sorry that you're having difficulties," I said carefully. "But I'm not responsible for solving them." "I know that." "I do. I miss you, Ma. I miss talking to you. I miss having you in my life. You had me in your life, Marcus. For 70 years, you had all of me. Everything I was, everything I had, everything I could give. And you threw it away because you thought you could take what you wanted without having to give anything back. I made mistakes. Big ones. I know that now." "What do you know now that you didn't know before?" "I know that I took you for granted. I know that I treated you like you were just there to serve me. I know that I hurt you in ways that probably can't be forgiven." It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever heard from him, and it sounded genuine. But I'd learned to be suspicious of sincerity from someone who'd lied to me so expertly for so long. "If you know all that," I said, "then you understand why things can't go back to the way they were." "I understand. But maybe they could be something different? Something better? What would that look like?" "I don't know. I haven't figured that out yet. But maybe we could start small. Maybe we could just talk sometimes. Maybe I could prove to you that I'm capable of being the son you deserved instead of the one you got. The conversation continued for over an hour. We talked about his childhood, about the mistakes we'd both made, about the resentment and hurt that had poisoned our relationship for so long. He asked about my life in Nevada, and for the first time, seemed genuinely interested in my answer rather than looking for angles to exploit. By the end of the call, I felt something I hadn't expected, a tiny seed of hope. Not hope that we could return to the past, that was impossible and undesirable, but hope that we might be able to build something new. Something based on mutual respect rather than obligation, on choice rather than duty. Can I call you again? He asked as we prepared to hang up. You can call, I said. But I can't promise how often I'll answer or how long we'll talk. This has to happen on my terms now, Marcus. I won't go back to being someone who exists primarily to meet your needs. I understand. And Ma? Yes? Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas, Marcus. After I hung up, I sat in the darkness of my living room for a long time, processing the conversation and my reaction to it. The old Eleanor would have been planning how to help him get back on his feet, would have been mentally calculating how much money he might need to get his life together, would have been making excuses for his behavior and preparing to welcome him back with open arms. The new Eleanor was more cautious. I'd learned that people could say anything they wanted to say, what mattered was what they did consistently over time. If Marcus wanted a relationship with me, he would have to prove that he was capable of treating me with respect and kindness. And if he wasn't capable of that, then I was perfectly content to live without him. That was perhaps the biggest change in my life. I was no longer afraid of being alone. Loneliness, I discovered, was about being with people who didn't see you or value you. Solitude was about being comfortable in your own company. I'd learned to enjoy my own company, and that made me much less willing to tolerate people who didn't. Over the next few months, Marcus called occasionally. The conversations were tentative at first, both of us feeling our way toward a new dynamic. He would ask about my life, and I would share selectively. I would ask about his life, and he would answer honestly without immediately segueing into requests for help or complaints about his circumstances. Gradually, a different relationship began to emerge. We talked about books we were reading, movies we'd seen, memories from his childhood that weren't tainted by resentment. He even asked for my advice sometimes, not about money or practical problems, but about emotional issues he was working through. The first time he called just to check on me, without any agenda or underlying request, I almost cried. It was such a small thing, but it represented a fundamental shift in how he saw me. I wasn't just a resource to be managed anymore, I was a person worth caring about. The real test came in early summer. Marcus called to tell me that he'd been offered a job in Phoenix, a good job with a construction company that specialized in solar installation. It was exactly the kind of opportunity he needed to rebuild his life, but it required him to relocate and cover his own moving expenses. The old Eleanor would have immediately offered to pay for everything. The new Eleanor listened to his excitement about the opportunity and said, "That sounds wonderful. I'm proud of you for landing such a good position." "It is wonderful," he said. "And Ma, I want you to know that I'm going to make this work. I'm going to prove to myself and to you that I can be successful on my own." "I believe you can," I said, and I meant it. "It's going to be tight financially until I get my first few paychecks, but I've been saving up and I think I can make it work." I waited for the request for money. It didn't come. We talked for another 20 minutes about his plans, his excitement, his nervousness about the move. When we hung up, no money had been requested or offered. 3 days later, he called again. "Ma, I have a confession to make. I called you the other day hoping you'd offer to help with the moving expenses. When you didn't, I was frustrated and disappointed. But then I realized something, you not offering to pay was actually a gift. It forced me to figure out how to handle it myself, and I did. I sold some things, picked up some extra work, and I have enough to make the move without help. How does that feel?" I asked. "Scary. But also good. Like I'm finally acting like a grown man instead of a teenager with a safety net." That conversation marked a turning point. Marcus moved to Phoenix and thrived in his new job. He called regularly, not to ask for things but to share his life. He talked about colleagues he was getting to know, challenges he was facing at work, ways he was growing and changing. For my part, I began to share more of my new life as well. I told him about my friends in Henderson, about the traveling I was doing, about the charitable work that was becoming increasingly important to me. I even told him about Frank, the bookstore owner who had become a significant part of my life. "You're dating?" Marcus asked, and I could hear the surprise in his voice. "I suppose I am," I said. "Does that bother you?" "No, it's just, I never thought of you as someone who would date." You were always just my mother, you know? It's weird thinking of you as a woman with your own life and interests. I've always been a woman with my own life and interests. I just forgot that for a while. I'm glad you remembered. We began to see each other occasionally. Marcus would fly to Las Vegas for weekend visits, and I would drive to Phoenix sometimes to see his apartment and meet his friends. These visits were different from anything we'd experienced before. We were two adults choosing to spend time together rather than family members trapped by obligation. He met Frank and was surprisingly gracious about the relationship. He even asked me for advice about a woman he was interested in, treating my opinion as valuable rather than just making conversation. Most importantly, he began to acknowledge the years of pain he'd caused me. Not in dramatic, guilt-ridden confessions, but in small, consistent ways. He would reference how difficult I must have found certain situations. He would thank me for sacrifices I'd made that he'd previously taken for granted. He would ask how I was doing emotionally, not just physically. One evening in late fall, we were sitting on the patio of his apartment in Phoenix, watching the sunset paint the desert mountains in shades of gold and purple. Out of nowhere, he said, "Ma, do you remember when I was little and I used to have nightmares? Of course. You'd come running into my room at least twice a week. And you'd always let me climb into bed with you, even though I probably kept you awake for hours with my tossing and turning. You were scared. That's what mothers do for scared children. But it wasn't just when I was little, was it? You've been letting me climb into your bed my whole life. Metaphorically, I mean. You've been taking care of my fears and problems and messes for 40 years. I didn't say anything, but I could feel tears forming in my eyes. I took advantage of that, he continued. I took advantage of your love and your generosity and your need to be needed. I turned you into someone who existed to take care of me instead of someone who deserved to be taken care of. Marcus, let me finish, please. I need to say this. I'm sorry, Ma. I'm sorry for stealing from you, for lying to you, for treating you like a convenience instead of a person. I'm sorry for making you feel like love was something you had to buy instead of something you deserved to receive freely. The tears were flowing now, not just from my eyes but from his as well. I'm sorry it took almost losing you completely for me to understand what I was doing. And I'm grateful, so grateful, that you were strong enough to save yourself, even if it meant risking everything we had. We sat in silence for a long time after that, watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky. Finally, I reached over and took his hand. I forgive you, I said. But more importantly, I forgive me. What do you need to forgive yourself for? For believing that sacrifice was the same thing as love. For teaching you that I didn't deserve respect by not requiring it. For almost dying in that apartment in the Bronx, emotionally speaking, because I was so afraid of being alone that I accepted being ignored. You taught me a lot of things, Ma. Some of them were right, and some of them were wrong. But the most important thing you taught me by example over the past 2 years. What's that? That it's never too late to start over. That you can love someone and still refuse to let them destroy you. And that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable them anymore. As I sit here now, 3 years after that conversation, I can tell you that our relationship isn't perfect. We're still figuring out how to be family members who are also independent adults. There are moments of tension, times when old patterns try to reassert themselves. But Marcus has become someone I genuinely enjoy spending time with. He's interesting and thoughtful and capable of caring about other people's needs as well as his own. He's building a good life in Phoenix, has been promoted twice at his job, and is in a healthy relationship with a woman who treats him well and expects the same in return. More importantly, he's someone I trust. When he says he's going to do something, he does it. When he expresses concern for my well-being, I know it's genuine. When he shares his thoughts and feelings, I don't have to wonder what he's really after. As for me, I'm living a life I never imagined possible. The mining operation has been even more successful than our most optimistic projections, and I'm financially secure beyond anything I could have dreamed. But that's not the most important change. The most important change is that I know who I am when I'm not defined by other people's needs. I know what I like and what I don't like, what I'm willing to tolerate and what I'm not. I know that I'm interesting and capable and deserving of love and respect. I'm still giving money away, but I'm doing it strategically and joyfully. I've helped dozens of single mothers finish their education. I've funded programs that teach elderly people how to avoid financial scams. I've endowed a scholarship at a community college in Nevada for students over 50 who are starting new careers. I'm also writing. It started as a way to process everything I'd been through, but it's become something more. I'm working on a book about financial exploitation of elderly people by family members. I want other people to recognize the warning signs that I missed for so long. Frank and I got married last spring. It was a small ceremony in the desert, with Marcus and his girlfriend and a handful of our closest friends. At 75, I never expected to experience the nervous excitement of a new bride, but that's exactly what I felt. Our relationship is everything I didn't know I was missing. Frank sees me, really sees me, as a complete person rather than a collection of services I can provide. He's interested in my thoughts, respects my opinions, and supports my decisions even when they're different from what he would choose. Most importantly, he doesn't need to be taken care of. He's a partner, not a dependent. We take care of each other in the way that healthy couples do, sharing responsibilities and supporting each other's goals rather than one person sacrificing everything for the other. Marcus was my best man at the wedding. In his speech, he talked about watching me become the person I was always meant to be. My mother taught me that it's never too late to graduate, he said. She graduated from being someone who lived for other people to someone who lives for herself. And all of us who love her are better off because she did. I think about that word, graduated, often. It perfectly captures what happened to me. I didn't just change, I grew into something new. I completed one phase of my life and moved on to another, better one. The desert that once represented abandonment and betrayal has become my sanctuary. I visit the mining site regularly, not because I need to oversee operations, I have excellent management for that, but because it reminds me of who I am now. Standing there among the rock formations where my grandfather once chased his dreams, I feel connected to a legacy of perseverance and hope. Sometimes I think about that day when Marcus left me in the desert. Not literally, that was dramatic license for the opening of this story, but emotionally. The day when I realized that my own son was willing to destroy me to get what he wanted. It was the worst day of my life and also, paradoxically, the beginning of the best part of my life. Because that's when I learned the difference between being abandoned and being liberated. Marcus didn't leave me to die in the desert. He left me to live there. To discover not just gold buried in the earth, but strength buried in myself. The treasure was real, all $100 million of it. But the more valuable treasure was learning that I was worth fighting for, that I deserved respect and kindness, and that love shouldn't cost everything I had to give. I want to leave you with this: no matter how old you are, no matter how entrenched your relationships have become, no matter how afraid you are of being alone, it's never too late to graduate to the next phase of your life. It's never too late to start requiring the respect you deserve. It's never too late to stop buying love and start expecting it to be freely given. The desert is vast and hot and sometimes frightening, but it's also where you discover what you're really made of. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you find treasure there too. But let me tell you about the other treasures I found along the way, the ones that had nothing to do with gold or money or financial security. These were the discoveries that truly changed my life, that transformed me from a woman who existed in the shadows of other people's needs into someone who could stand confidently in her own light. The first treasure was friendship. Real friendship, not the kind based on what I could provide or how useful I could be, but the kind built on mutual respect and genuine affection. Margaret, the retired teacher who taught me poker, became my closest confidant. We'd spend hours talking about books, sharing memories from our younger days, and planning adventures for our golden years. Margaret had her own story of liberation. She'd spent 30 years married to a man who dismissed her intelligence, who made her feel small and insignificant. When he died 5 years earlier, she'd expected to feel lost and alone. Instead, she felt free for the first time in decades. Eleanor, she told me one evening as we sat on my patio watching the sunset, I spent so many years thinking that love meant making yourself smaller so someone else could feel bigger. But real love, the kind worth having, makes both people larger. Her words resonated deep in my soul because they captured something I'd been struggling to articulate. The relationship I'd had with Marcus wasn't love, despite what I'd told myself. It was codependency disguised as devotion, enabling wrapped in the language of sacrifice. Real love, I was learning, required boundaries. It demanded honesty, even when the truth was uncomfortable. It insisted on reciprocity, on both parties contributing to the relationship's health and growth. I found that kind of love with Frank, but it took me months to trust it. Our first few dates were tentative affairs, coffee meetings that never lasted more than an hour because I was so accustomed to measuring every interaction in terms of what it would cost me emotionally or financially. Frank was patient with my wariness. He'd been married for 40 years to a woman who died of cancer 3 years earlier, and he understood the delicate process of opening your heart again after it's been torn apart. He never pushed for more than I was ready to give, never tried to rush the natural progression of our relationship. The first time he offered to pay for dinner, I nearly had a panic attack. Not because I couldn't afford it, by then, I was wealthier than I'd ever imagined possible, but because accepting his generosity felt foreign and dangerous. What would he expect in return? What debt would I be incurring? Eleanor, he said gently when he noticed my distress, I asked you to dinner because I enjoy your company. I want to pay because it makes me happy to do something nice for someone I care about. There are no strings attached, no expectations beyond the hope that you'll say yes if I ask you out again. That night, I went home and cried. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being seen as someone worthy of kindness without having to earn it first. Frank introduced me to parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. He loved to hike, and despite my initial protests about being too old and out of shape, he coaxed me onto desert trails where I discovered muscles I didn't know I still had. He was passionate about classical music, and through him, I learned to appreciate symphonies and operas that I'd always dismissed as boring. Most importantly, he showed me what it felt like to be with someone who was genuinely interested in my thoughts and opinions. Frank would ask what I thought about books we'd both read, about political events, about philosophical questions. He'd listen to my answers, really listen, and respond with thoughtful comments that showed he valued my perspective. I'd spent so many years having my ideas dismissed or ignored that I'd almost stopped having them. Living with Marcus had taught me that my role was to facilitate other people's thoughts and plans, not to have any of my own. Rediscovering my own intellectual curiosity was like finding a room in my house that I'd forgotten existed. The second treasure I found was purpose beyond servitude. For 70 years, my purpose had been defined by other people's needs. I was a mother, a caregiver, a problem solver, a financial resource. But I'd never asked myself what I wanted to accomplish with my own life, what legacy I wanted to leave that had nothing to do with the people I'd taken care of. The scholarship fund I established for single mothers was just the beginning. As word spread about my story, how I'd discovered the treasure, how I'd fought to protect it from family exploitation, I started receiving letters from other elderly people who'd found themselves in similar situations. There was Rose, an 80-year-old woman in Florida whose adult children had been systematically draining her savings through a series of manufactured emergencies. There was Harold, a widower in Ohio whose son had convinced him to sign over power of attorney and then promptly sold his house and moved him into a substandard nursing home. There was Maria, a grandmother in Texas who'd spent her life savings helping her daughter start a business that existed only on paper. Each letter broke my heart, but they also ignited something in me that I'd never felt before, righteous indignation not just for myself, but for others who were being victimized in the same way I had been. I started small, funding legal aid for elderly people who were being financially exploited by family members. I worked with attorneys to develop educational materials about recognizing the warning signs of elder abuse. I lobbied for stronger laws protecting seniors from financial predators, even when those predators were their own children. The work was emotionally exhausting but deeply rewarding. For the first time in my life, I was using my resources and my experience to make a real difference in the world. I wasn't just giving money away randomly, I was strategically addressing a problem that I understood intimately. Dr. Martinez, my mining attorney who'd become a mentor and friend, helped me establish a foundation focused specifically on preventing family-based financial exploitation of elderly people. We called it the Dignity Foundation, because that's what these crimes really steal. Not just money, but dignity, self-respect, and the belief that you matter beyond what you can provide for others. The foundation grew beyond anything I'd imagined. We funded research into the psychological patterns that make elderly people vulnerable to exploitation. We developed training programs for bank employees, social workers, and medical professionals to help them recognize when an older person might be under financial duress. We created support groups for survivors of family financial abuse, because I'd learned how isolating and shameful the experience could be. But perhaps the most important program we developed was the Graduation Initiative, a series of workshops designed to help elderly people recognize their own worth and establish healthy boundaries with adult children who had become financially dependent on them. The name came from Marcus's speech at my wedding, but the concept came from my own experience. So many elderly people, particularly women of my generation, had been conditioned to believe that their value was tied to their usefulness to others. Learning to graduate from that mindset, to see yourself as a complete person deserving of respect and kindness, was often the first step in protecting yourself from exploitation. I started speaking at conferences, sharing my story with audiences of social workers, attorneys, and other elderly people who were struggling with similar issues. The first time I stood on a stage in front of 200 people, my hands shook so badly I could barely hold my notes. But as I told my story, as I saw recognition flash in people's eyes, as I watched other survivors nod in understanding, I felt something I'd never experienced before. I felt powerful. Not in the sense of having power over others, but in the sense of having agency over my own life and the ability to help others find theirs. The speaking engagements led to media attention I'd never sought but learned to navigate. Newspapers wanted to interview the desert treasure grandmother who'd fought off her own son's attempted fraud. Television producers were fascinated by the story of an elderly woman who'd transformed a family betrayal into a crusade for justice. I was careful about these appearances, always insisting that the focus be on the broader issue of elder abuse rather than just my personal story. But I also learned to use the media attention strategically, to raise awareness about a problem that too many people preferred to ignore. The third treasure I found was creativity. Living with Frank, surrounded by books and music and art, I rediscovered parts of myself that had been dormant for decades. I started writing, not just the book about financial exploitation that I'd initially planned, but poetry and short stories and personal essays about the experience of reinventing yourself in your 70s. Writing became a form of therapy, a way to process the complex emotions I felt about my relationship with Marcus and my new life in Nevada. But it also became something more, a way to connect with other people who were going through their own processes of transformation and liberation. My first published essay appeared in a magazine for older adults. It was about the difference between loneliness and solitude, about how I'd learned to enjoy my own company after spending so many years existing primarily as an extension of someone else. The response was overwhelming. I received dozens of letters from readers who said the essay had given them permission to value their own presence in their lives. That led to more writing opportunities, and eventually to a regular column in a national publication. I wrote about everything from the challenges of dating in your 70s to the joy of discovering new interests when you finally have time and resources to pursue them. But the common thread through all my writing was the theme of late-in-life liberation, of discovering that it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be. The book about elder abuse took 3 years to complete, partly because the research was emotionally draining and partly because I was learning how to write for a broader audience. But when Graduated, A Guide to Protecting Yourself from Family Financial Abuse, was finally published, it became a bestseller in the self-help category. More importantly, it became a resource that helped thousands of people recognize and address exploitation they might not have even realized they were experiencing. The book tour that followed was exhausting but exhilarating, taking me to cities I'd never visited to speak with people whose stories echoed my own. In Denver, I met a man whose daughter had been forging his signature on checks for months. In Seattle, I spoke with a woman whose son had convinced her to take out a reverse mortgage on her house and then disappeared with the proceeds. In Atlanta, I met a grandfather who'd spent his retirement savings on a grandchild's supposed medical emergency that turned out to be an elaborate lie to fund a drug habit. Each story was heartbreaking, but what struck me most was how many of these people blamed themselves for being victimized. They felt stupid for being deceived, guilty for not trusting their family members, ashamed that they'd been so desperate for love and connection that they'd ignored obvious red flags. These conversations reinforced my belief that the real crime in family financial abuse isn't just the theft of money, it's the theft of self-worth, the systematic erosion of an elderly person's confidence in their own judgment and value. The fourth treasure I found was physical vitality I'd thought was lost forever. Living in Nevada, hiking with Frank, eating well for the first time in years instead of surviving on whatever was cheapest and fastest, I began to feel stronger and more energetic than I had in decades. I started seeing doctors regularly for the first time in my adult life, not because I was sick but because I finally had the insurance and resources to prioritize my health. I discovered that many of the aches and pains I'd accepted as inevitable parts of aging were actually consequences of stress, poor nutrition, and neglect. With proper medical care, physical therapy, and a better diet, I began to feel like a younger version of myself. Not young exactly, I was still in my 70s, but vital and capable in ways I'd forgotten were possible. I took up swimming at the community center, bought a bicycle and started riding the trails around Henderson, even tried yoga classes despite initial embarrassment about my flexibility and balance. Each new physical challenge was a reminder that my body was still capable of growth and change, that I didn't have to accept decline as inevitable. The improved physical health had psychological benefits as well. Feeling strong in my body made me feel more confident in asserting myself in other areas of my life. There was something powerful about knowing I could hike 5 miles in the desert or swim 30 laps in the pool. It reinforced my sense of myself as someone who could handle challenges rather than someone who needed to be taken care of. Most importantly, I learned to appreciate my body for what it could do rather than criticizing it for how it looked. After years of seeing myself only in relation to my usefulness to Marcus, learning to value my physical self for my own enjoyment was revolutionary. Frank and I took dance lessons, something I'd always wanted to try but never had the time or confidence to pursue. I was terrible at first, stepping on his toes and getting confused by the steps, but I didn't care. For the first time in my adult life, I was doing something purely for the joy of it, not because someone needed me to or because it served some practical purpose. The fifth and perhaps most profound treasure I found was spiritual peace. I'd never been particularly religious, but something about the vastness of the desert, the silence of those early morning hikes, the sense of connection to something larger than my immediate concerns, awakened a spiritual dimension in my life that I'd never explored. I didn't join a church or adopt any specific belief system, but I began to experience what I can only describe as a sense of grace. Standing on the property where my grandfather had chased his dreams, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose, I felt connected to generations of people who'd struggled and persevered and found meaning in the face of hardship. This spiritual awakening wasn't dramatic or sudden, it was a gradual recognition that my life had meaning beyond the roles I'd played for other people. I was part of something larger, connected to a web of human experience that included both suffering and joy, both betrayal and redemption. The meditation practice I developed was simple: 20 minutes each morning sitting quietly on my patio, watching the desert come alive as the sun rose. I didn't try to empty my mind or achieve any particular state, I just observed my thoughts and feelings without judgment, letting them flow through me like water. These quiet moments became the foundation for everything else I was building in my new life. They gave me the clarity to make decisions based on my own values rather than other people's expectations. They provided the peace I needed to process the complex emotions surrounding my relationship with Marcus. They offered the perspective I needed to see my story not just as personal trauma but as part of a larger human experience of growth and transformation. As I sit here now, preparing to conclude this story that has taken me hours to tell, I'm aware of how different my life is from what I imagined it would be when I was sitting in that cramped apartment in the Bronx, waiting for Marcus to come home for lunch he would never eat. I'm 78 years old now, and I've never been happier or more fulfilled. Frank and I celebrated our third wedding anniversary last month with a trip to Italy, my first time in Europe, something I'd dreamed about for decades but never thought I could afford or deserve. Marcus and his wife Sarah, they got married 2 years ago in a small ceremony in Phoenix, visit us regularly. Their relationship is healthy and equal in ways that my marriage to Robert never was, and watching them together gives me hope for the future. Marcus has become a man I respect and enjoy spending time with, someone who's learned to give as well as receive, to support as well as be supported. He's also become an advocate in his own right, speaking about the damage that financial dependence on elderly parents can do to both generations. He's written about his own experience of transformation, about learning to see his mother as a person rather than a resource, about the shame he felt when he realized how deeply he'd hurt someone he claimed to love. Our relationship now isn't perfect, no relationship is, but it's honest and reciprocal in ways our old relationship never was. When we spend time together, it's because we both want to be there. When we support each other, it comes from love rather than obligation. When we disagree, we can discuss our differences without one of us having to sacrifice their position to keep the peace. The mining operation continues to be profitable beyond our wildest projections, but the money has become almost secondary to everything else I've built. The Dignity Foundation now operates in 12 states and has helped thousands of elderly people protect themselves from family financial exploitation. My book has been translated into 6 languages and is used in training programs for professionals who work with elderly clients. But perhaps the most important impact I've had is simply in showing other people that it's never too late to start over, never too late to demand the respect you deserve, never too late to build a life that reflects your own values and dreams rather than other people's expectations. I get letters regularly from people who've read my book or heard me speak, people who've found the courage to set boundaries with exploitative family members, to pursue dreams they'd set aside, to value themselves enough to insist on being treated well. There's Margaret in Portland who finally told her alcoholic daughter she wouldn't give her any more money for rent but would pay for rehab if she was serious about getting sober. There's Robert in Miami who discovered his own passion for painting at age 75 and now has his work displayed in local galleries. There's Linda in Chicago who divorced her husband of 40 years after realizing that his constant criticism and control had nothing to do with love. Each of these stories reminds me that my journey from victim to victor, from doormat to dignified woman, is part of a larger movement of people who are refusing to accept that growing older means becoming invisible or powerless. The desert that once seemed like a place of abandonment and death has become my sanctuary, my symbol of transformation and rebirth. I visit the original treasure site regularly, not just for business reasons but as a form of pilgrimage, a reminder of how far I've traveled from the broken woman who once sat in a Bronx apartment believing she deserved nothing better than scraps of affection and conditional love. Standing there among the rocks where my grandfather once chased his dreams, holding pieces of gold that represent not just financial security but personal liberation, I offer a prayer of gratitude for the journey that brought me here. Gratitude for the betrayal that forced me to find my own strength, for the loneliness that taught me to value my own company, for the fear that pushed me to discover I was braver than I'd ever imagined. I'm grateful even for the pain, because without it I never would have learned the difference between love and enabling, between kindness and self-sacrifice, between being needed and being valued. If there's one thing I want people to take away from my story, it's this: you are never too old, never too set in your ways, never too afraid to start demanding better for yourself. The people who truly love you will respect your boundaries and celebrate your growth. The people who don't, well, their absence will make room for better relationships, for people who see your worth and honor it. The desert is calling to all of us who have accepted less than we deserve, who have made ourselves small to make others comfortable, who have measured our worth by how much we can sacrifice for people who may not even appreciate our offerings. Some of you are living in emotional deserts right now, feeling abandoned and forgotten by the very people you've spent your lives serving. But deserts, I've learned, are not places of death, they're places of transformation. They strip away everything that's not essential, everything that's not really you, until only the strongest, most authentic parts remain. In the desert, you discover what you're really made of. You learn that you can survive on less than you thought you needed. You find beauty in starkness, strength in simplicity, hope in the most unlikely places. And if you're very lucky, if you're very brave, if you're willing to keep digging even when everyone tells you you're crazy, you might just find treasure. Real treasure. Not just gold buried in the ground, but the infinitely more valuable gold that's buried in yourself, your worth, your strength, your right to be loved and respected for who you are rather than what you can provide. The treasure is there, waiting for you. It's been there all along, buried beneath years of conditioning and compromise, beneath all the times you said yes when you meant no, beneath all the moments you made yourself smaller so someone else could feel bigger. You just have to be brave enough to start digging. Have you ever felt like you were giving everything to people who saw you only as a resource to be managed? Have you ever realized that the person you thought you were protecting was actually the one you needed protection from? Tell me in the comments. Your story matters, and sharing it might help someone else find the courage to start their own journey to the desert. If this story touched something in your heart, please like this video and subscribe. Every person who hears this message and recognizes themselves in it is another person who might find their way to their own treasure, their own liberation, their own graduation into the life they deserve. Because opening my heart and sharing this story takes courage, but I'm still here, still standing, still growing at 78. And if I can do it, so can you. The desert is calling. Are you ready to answer?